first view, and this is the one, again, if you've like grew up in the church, you're probably most familiar with this one, 6-day Young Earth Creationism. 6-day Young Earth Creationism. For each of these, we'll have major beliefs, and then we'll kind of try and talk them out. So 6-day Young Earth Creationist, this is like Answers in Genesis, a number of different modern organizations and religious movements are really kind of founded around this belief system. They would say that the creation days of Genesis 1, day 1, light and dark, day 2, sea and sky, that framework we went through, they would say they were 6 literal 24-hour days, and that occurred somewhere between 6,000 to 12,000 years ago. So that's where you get the 6-day, because they would say each day is a literal 24-hour day, and the idea of a young Earth, that the Earth itself did not exist, let's say 13,000 years ago, and it was within the last 12,000 years that everything you see around you came into existence. Okay. So part of this understanding is that 3,300 years before Jesus, the surface of the earth was radically rearranged by Noah's flood. And again, for those of you less familiar with the church and the Bible and Christian teaching, Genesis 1, God creates everything. A couple chapters later, Genesis 6, God decides to send this flood. And the text describes it as this massive global flood. And people who hold to this understanding of creation say, yes, it was literally a flood where water literally covered every surface of the earth, so much so that Noah in his ark with all the animals were floating above the highest mountains. And that flood uh, necessarily massively changed the earth. And so it changed the tectonic plates, it changed the pressure of the water. Again, I'm not a scientist, but they would say that event, that global flood event, accounts for anything that we see that makes it look like the earth isn't as young as the Bible says that it is. Global flood. So, as a result, all land animals and birds not in Noah's Ark, along with many sea creatures, perished, and many of which were subsequently buried in the flood sediments. And so, when you go and you see fossils and you learn about all the different layers, people say, yeah, that didn't happen over the course of billions of years. That happened all at once, global flood. So, one of the ways I think is helpful to think about each of these theories is to kind of ask yourself, and that gets back to my little picture here, how did this group understand the dinosaurs? If you can kind of keep that in mind, it'll help you keep each one straight. So in this group, they would say, yeah, dinosaurs existed. They were created on day 6 with humans. They coexisted until the flood. And they were like getting along with humans until Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Go ahead and read that story in Genesis 3 if you're not familiar. So, like, Adam and Eve were like friends with dinosaurs, and then because of the fall, changed the nature of the relationship. So now dinosaurs are like kind of scary. But nevertheless, like, dinosaurs existed. Some creationists would say that dinosaurs were not on the ark, and that's when they went extinct. Other creationists would say that actually dinosaurs were on the ark, but that like Noah took baby dinosaurs, or he took eggs of dinosaurs, and that after the flood, the atmosphere changed, and so dinosaurs weren't able to live anymore, and that was kind of their major extinction event. Some 6-day Young Earth creationists, and this is actually where I kind of was when I was a younger person, so I have a lot of love in my heart for this perspective. They would say dinosaurs never actually went extinct. And that, like, in medieval paintings and things where they're fighting dragons, maybe it was actually dinosaurs. Loch Ness Monster, maybe it's really a dinosaur. Anyway, I just throwing that out there. Um, that's what the fossils are, though. Fossils come from Noah's flood. Like I said, therefore, global catastrophic flood is responsible for most, if but not all, but most of the rock layers and fossils and all the carbon dating. So anybody that's saying the Earth is older than 12,000 years, they can't possibly know that because they're not taking into account major global flood. Okay. Um, why is this a good argument? Each of these theories have something going for them. And here's what I think 6-day Young Earth creationists have for them. Genesis is just read as a history. It is kind of the most simple and straightforward way to attack the text. And Jesus, when he's teaching in the New Testament, he talks about people in Genesis, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, and he is talking about them as if their history is as they happened, the way the story seems to suggest that they happened. So if the New Testament, and Jesus especially, is talking about these events as if they happened the way they are described as happening, as Christians, that should count quite a bit for us. And so I think it does. Likewise, Exodus 20, verse 11, which is part of the Ten Commandments, God's telling the people, commandment number 4, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Why? Because God created on 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested. And so, again, like we always want to use the Bible to interpret the Bible. And so, in this text over here in Exodus 20, it sounds like God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. As humans, we're supposed to follow that pattern. So, it must have been 6 literal days. Okay. If you're wondering where the young Earth part came from, like why 6,000 to 12,000 years, it's one way to read the genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. And pretty much everybody agrees Abraham lived somewhere around 2000 BC. Like that's where he fits into the timeline of overall human history. And so if you have a genealogy that goes back from Abraham to Adam, you can kind of do some genealogical math. Now there are reasons not to read the genealogies that way. But Six-Day Young Earth Creationists would read them that way, and it is a way to read them, and there you have kind of the timing for that. And then yeah, I mean, for a really long time in church history, it was kind of taken for granted that the Genesis narrative told the story of how God created the world. Okay. So it's not universal, right? There's different discussions on that. But for a long time, there was no reason to question it. And a lot of different religions and cultures have their own creation myths and creation stories. And this was, Judaism and Christianity's. And so there's something to be said about the fact that a lot of people over the course of time have kind of assumed that Genesis 1 is meant to be read as straightforward. So why not continue to read it that way? All right, there are some arguments for. However, each of these theories also have arguments that do not go in their favor. Um, Here are some of the arguments against Six-Day Young Earth Creationism. If we go back to our little framework here, um, it's problematic for a couple of reasons. Day 4 is when God creates the sun, moon, and stars. How do we know how long a 24-hour day is? Well, it's because that's the amount of time it takes for the Earth to turn and in relation to the sun. Okay. However, if God isn't even creating until the sun on day 4, for what reason would we say the first 3 days are 6 literal or 3 literal 24-hour days? Right? Like there's no sun to govern the time, so who's to say that the first 3 days should be 24 hours long? I think that's probably the biggest issue. It's one of the issues. Another issue with Six-Day Young Earth creationism is the creation of humans. So God gets into the details of creating humans in Genesis 2. Go read it for yourself, where he talks about creating Adam from the dust and Eve from his rib. But that recreation story under this idea is all happening on day 6. Because in Genesis 1, God creates Adam and Eve. He creates male and female in his image. And then Genesis 2, it goes into detail how God created Adam and then Eve. And so that's happening on day 6. The problem is, but before God creates Eve, after he creates Adam in Genesis 2, there's this back and forth where God is like, it's not good for man to be alone. No suitable helper is found. God brings all the animals on this like parade in front of Adam, and Adam names all of the animals. And then God creates Eve. So the idea is that all of that is happening on day 6, which means that like, unless Adam is like tiger, lion, bear, amoeba, grasshopper, like, like literally just like naming every single animal super, super, super fast. I mean, that's a lot to have happen in a literal 24-hour day before Eve even gets created. So those are just two of the issues within the text itself. Again, I'm not a scientist. This particular view also does disagree with a lot of what modern science is saying about things like the age of the Earth, things like the progression of different species of animals and life forms. So there's a number of issues there. Um, but I think the issue itself that between the sun not existing until day 4, and that's a very long day, day 6 for Adam. I don't think you even really need to bring, modern scientific evolutionary theory into the conversation to say there are some challenges with 6-day young Earth creationism. Likewise, this idea of reading the genealogies to come up with a young Earth um, has not been the way that most of church history has read that text. That was something that came about more in the last 300 years. And so, while there has been kind of a assumption that, well, yeah, sure, if Genesis says it, that's how it happened, the idea of coming up with a exact date and saying, well, it must have been within this young Earth category of time, that's actually a pretty recent thing. And so that is also a weakness in this particular perspective. But hey, jump on in the comments. Do you see any other arguments against 6-day young Earth creationism? Okay, so to summarize, first view, 6-day young Earth, God created everything in 6 literal 24-hour days, somewhere between 6,000 to 12,000 years ago. The global flood accounts for any disagreement with modern science. And what do we do about the dinosaurs? They existed alongside humans. They went extinct after the flood, or did they? Okay.